No.
Gentleman from California has 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my friend and colleague from Virginia, the ranking member, Mr. Scott, for his leadership on this issue. I'm here to express my strong opposition to H.R. 6094. Prior to the Department of Labor taking action this year, the rules governing overtime were woefully out of date. In 1975, 60% of salaried workers had access to overtime protections. 4 decades later, that number was just 8%. The result is that millions of American workers were denied a fair day's pay for a fair day's work for far too long. On numerous occasions, my colleagues across the aisle have conceded that the threshold should be increased. But they say that this increase is too much too soon. Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, an incremental change would have been appropriate 3 decades ago. Now, we need bold action to restore overtime protections for middle-class workers. I find it ironic that this bill is called the Regulatory Relief for Small Businesses, Schools, and Nonprofits Act. After decades of long hours and low pay, it is working families that need relief. This bill takes money out of the pockets of middle-class Americans right before the holiday season. In reality, this bill should be called the Grinch Act. The overtime rule will ensure that 4 million Americans will have access to overtime protections. An additional 8.9 million workers will see their overtime pay protections strengthened. These middle-class workers will either get an increase in pay or more time to spend with their families, or both. This is plainly one of the most significant steps we can take to support the middle class. Now, I'm not blind to the concerns of the business community. I've heard from small businesses, institutions of higher education, and nonprofit organizations in my own district who are worried about the impact that this rule will have on their bottom lines. But the truth is that while this rule is a big deal for workers, it will not have a significant consequence for businesses. The Department of Labor estimates that the total cost of the rule will amount to less than 0.1% of total U.S. payroll costs. I repeat, less than 0.1% of total U.S. payroll costs. Among workers affected by the rule, only 1 in 5 regularly work overtime. At universities and colleges, employees whose primary duties are teaching, lecturing, or instructing are exempt from overtime coverage under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Only 3.4% of all employees in colleges, universities, and junior colleges will be affected by this rule, and only 0.5% of those workers usually work overtime. And who are these workers? They are the people peeling potatoes in the dining hall. They are the landscapers cutting grass in the quad. And they are the sporting equipment managers who work in multi-million-dollar athletic facilities but can barely afford to support their families. They deserve to be paid for the hours they work. Employers have inexpensive options for complying with this rule. For example, they can work with their teams to ensure that their employees are only working 40 hours a week, preventing overwork as the Fair Labor Standards Act intended. Yes, we've heard concerns about the overtime rule from the business community, but we've also heard their support. Ranking Member Scott and Chairman Klein received a letter from the American Sustainable Business Council urging Congress to support the full implementation deadline of December 1st, 2016. These businesses believe that any delay would be unduly burdensome, as businesses have been preparing for the rule to go into effect this year. We've also received support from the nonprofits. I have here 2 letters, one with nearly 24 nonprofits to the Department of Labor offering support for the rule during the rulemaking process, and another letter with roughly 140 organizations supporting the final rule. And at this time, I ask unanimous consent to insert these 2 letters into the record.
Without objection.
Finally, I want to raise objection to the way that this legislation is being considered. H.R. 6094 was brought to the floor as an emergency measure, bypassing regular order. Mr. Speaker, an emergency is the epidemic of gun violence that kills 91 Americans every day. An emergency is averting a damaging shutdown and funding the federal government. Taking $6 million out of the pockets of hard-working Americans and preventing them from spending time with their families is not an emergency. And that is what H.R. 6094 would do. This legislation and the way it is being considered is a message to middle-class families that they are not a priority for this Congress. I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back.